Every so often through the years, I've had people who are just entering the ministry write to me and say, "Can you give me any advice?" And so that's what this video is about, just some short bits of advice. One of the things that has frustrated me over the last 15 and a half years of GCA as a public ministry is the fact that people who I would prefer to have stay with us leave us. Some because they're transferred, they have to go somewhere for their job, some for various other reasons, and some simply because they've joined another church. And I find this frustrating for myself because I would rather that everybody stay. I'm a nice guy. I want everybody to like me. And so I want people to just stay at GCA. Now, of course, had they all stayed, we would not have any place to seat them all. There'd be people in the parking lot. But one of the really helpful words of advice that I got just recently came to me third hand. So I have to begin with this disclaimer. This is a story that a friend told me about another friend. The fellow that I'm talking about was in the ministry for more than 40 years, and really in the mid-40s, about 45 years he was in the ministry. And a young preacher came to him and said, "Can you give me the most important thing you've learned in 40 years of ministry?" And he looked at the young man and he said, "Yes, remember this. People come and people go." And of course, the young man was kind of shocked. He thought he was going to get some deep profundity out of this older fella. But I was really glad to hear that story because it proves that it's kind of a universal thing within the church that people do have a tendency to come and go. It's the people who stay. It's the people who stick with you, who really kind of make the church what it is, who create the character in the environment of the church. Now, something that I've had to come to realize over time is that these people, as they come and go, they don't belong to me. Some of them might belong to GCA, and if they belong in that church, if God has assigned them to our church, then they're going to stay with our church because that's where God has placed them. But if God has a purpose for somebody that is elsewhere than GCA, I shouldn't stand in the way of that because I myself have left a number of churches through the years. And so I can't really be angry with anybody for leaving if their intention is to leave and continue in this Christian walk. Now, of course, there are always the folks who are attracted to GCA for one reason or another, and then they fall away simply because they either understand what we're really saying, that God is completely in control, or when trouble arises, like Jesus talked about, that when the trouble arises, they're going to fall away. There are those people who John talked about. If they were of us, they would have continued with us, but they went out from us because they weren't truly of us. But the ones who are truly of us stay with us and help us to create the environment of the church, and I'm very, very grateful for them. I have had some very long relationships and friendships within the church, and I'm really, really happy for them. But for the ones who leave, well, people come and people go. Now, this second word of advice goes back at least 20 years. I was in the midst of leaving a church where I had done a bit of preaching. I was part of the teaching staff, and I was starting a Bible study here in Rutherford County. And so in the midst of all that, I went to Michigan to visit a friend of mine who had been a pastor for a long time. And in the midst of our sharing a meal together, he looked up at me and said, "If God has called you to preach, He will call other people to hear you." Well, over the past couple of decades, as I've thought about that, I've realized that it's actually true. It's not biblical in that there's no verse I can pull out that says exactly that, but it certainly is biblical in that conceptually, if it is God who gifts men, if God is giving gifts to his church, if Christ has given some apostles and some prophets, some evangelists and some pastors and teachers to his church for the admonition, for the growth, for the education of the saints until we all come into the unity of the faith, then there also has to be people who are coming into that unity of faith. God is building his church. Jesus is building his church individual by individual. And every individual is given some gift that is beneficial for the whole body. And so God doesn't just choose leaders within the church, he chooses people within the church. And those people all come with the gifts that God has given them for the benefit, for the good of the whole body. And I've seen it time and time again. I've seen people come to GCA who had particular giftings that were really beneficial to us. And then they had to leave. They got transferred, or for one reason or another, they weren't going to be with us. And within a matter of days, sometimes, God will deliver someone else to the body who has that same gifting, that same ability, and it's really remarkable to watch. So if God calls you to preach, he will also call people to hear you, was the quote. And I'm starting to really like that quote, because in this day and age of YouTube and social media, there are people who have set up a webcam and build a website, and then they call what they're doing a ministry, even though they have no responsibility to a congregation of people. So there's no natural checks and balances on the way that they conduct themselves or conduct their ministry. I see the people of GCA that God has called to come alongside us as vitally, vitally important, not only in listening and learning and coming to that unity of the faith, but also in holding me responsible for whatever I say. So if God calls you to preach, he's going to call some people to hear you. Now, this next bit of advice is an old adage that I have heard pretty much my whole life. I think I first heard it back in college. And I think it's applicable here. The adage is, if you think you're a leader, you have to stop every once in a while and look behind you. If there's nobody there, you're not leading. I think the only way to be a good leader in the church is to lead by example, the same way that Paul said, be imitators of me as I'm an imitator of Christ. So the way to properly lead within the church is to follow hard after Christ and then encourage other people to do the same thing. Never insert yourself into the relationship. The relationship is God and Christ and the individual saint. And you don't want to make yourself some kind of priest or pope who gets in the middle of that relationship and says the way for you to get to God is to go through me. Instead, you're to lead people, and that leading is to lead them to Christ. And if you think you're a leader and there's no one behind you, you're not. Now, this last bit of advice is probably the most important in this video. And I learned this the hard way. Back in the early 2000s, I was going through a really, really difficult period. And I really thought that it was going to get the best of me. I really thought that it was going to destroy me. And I called my friend Elder Ward. Now, some of you have heard this story, but I hope to expand on it just a little bit. Elder Ward called me, and in the midst of all my trouble and pain, he said, never forget that this is the process through which God is making you into the man you're going to become. Well, at the time, that was difficult to hear. But now that I've lived with it for a good number of years, I realize that it's not just important to say that to people who are going through struggles or through trials. It really applies to everything. If God is sovereign, if God's in charge of everything that happens in His universe, if He's busy building His church and putting particular people with particular talents into His body, His bride for His Son, if all of that is true of God's absolute control over everything, then there's nothing that happens in this lifetime that is not designed to get us to the place that God has foreordained for us to be. We are predestined, according to Paul writing in Romans 8, we are predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. That's the person He has planned for us to be. And the process of getting us there involves a wide variety of joys and hardships and pain and difficulties. And every part of that, including the joys, including the victories of this life, every part of it is getting us to the point that God has determined we're going to reach. So always remember, whatever you're going through, that this is the process through which God is making you into the person He is determined you're going to become. And if you know that, then, like Paul writes, since there is no temptation, no trial taken you, but such is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not tempt you beyond what you're able, but will with the temptation provide a way of escape so that you may be able to bear it. If you know that a sovereign God is on your side and working out His sovereign will in human history, then no matter what the very high highs, they won't destroy you, and no matter what the very low lows, you will endure them and come out closer to the person God is making you into. So, that's the advice for today. I hope it helps. See you next time.